Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
And our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. And we're talking about separation of powers and checks and balances on this episode today. But first, Bobbi, let's talk about the OG influencer.
Ben Franklin's Virtues. This is our continuing short series where we present the civic virtues that Benjamin Franklin, one of our most significant founders, thought to be the most important. He thought these civic virtues or qualities that help individuals become better people and contribute to a stronger society mattered just as much as public action. As we work our way through these, think about how these civic virtues track in your own life. The seventh civic virtue is sincerity. Franklin said, quote, "Use no hurtful deceit, think innocently and justly, and if you speak, speak accordingly," end quote. When were you honest and thoughtful with your words? How did it affect someone or yourself?
And now our feature presentation.
And I titled this, Back to the Basics, Separation of Powers and Checks and Balances. Many Americans lack basic knowledge of U.S. government, with surveys showing significant misunderstanding of the three branches of government, the Constitution, and First Amendment rights. Key gaps include confusing the roles of Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court, as well as misunderstanding separation of powers and checks and balances. So starting with the three branches of government and their roles under a system of separation of powers and checks and balances is where we will start as we begin a deeper dive into some of the, quote, top civics topics misunderstood by Americans, end quote. A 2023 survey found that 44% of U.S. adults could not name all three branches of government, and many cannot identify the legislative role of Congress versus that of the chief executive or president. For those who can name the three branches of our government, most probably cannot identify what the basic duties and responsibilities of each branch is. So in this episode, we are going to name and examine the three branches of our U.S. government, explain the idea of separation of powers, and explain why there are three branches of government. We cannot discuss separation of powers without also talking about checks and balances and why the three branches are often referred to as being co-equal branches.
And when you say we're going back to the basics, we're going way back to where framers started to frame up this government.
So yes, way back in time and also way back when we started this podcast and we did some of these kind of brush overs of the basics, but we didn't dig in this deep. The framers established three branches and separation of powers mainly to prevent tyranny, which, if you remember, means preventing unrestrained power or an oppressive government, and to protect individual liberty by ensuring that no individual person or group could gain too much power. They did this by dividing government power or authority among the three independent branches, known as the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and by also creating a system of checks and balances where each branch could limit the excesses of the others. We cannot discuss separation of powers without also discussing checks and balances, as they go hand in hand. These ideas were inspired by an 18th century French judge, intellectual, historian, and philosopher who is known as Montesquieu, as well as being inspired by the framers' own experience with the British monarchy. The framers believed concentrated power in one person or group inevitably leads to abuse of power and is the, quote, very definition of tyranny, end quote. You'll hear that in a longer Madison quote that I'm going to give you a little later. The framers, including James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, saw this division of power as a necessary tool to manage the human tendency to abuse power and ensure a stable constitutional republic. Jefferson actually said, quote, "When once a republic is corrupted, there is no possibility of remedying any of the growing evils but by removing the corruption." In addition, the framers had also just experienced several years under the first U.S. Constitution, which was known as the Articles of Confederation, which was just a legislative branch with a one-house Congress with equal representation from each state. Each state only had one vote under the Articles of Confederation. We talked about that many, many moons ago as well. There was no single leader and no judiciary. The U.S. government under the Articles was extremely weak and ineffective.
This is maybe something that we can just thread through as we go through this episode. Is it says that checks and balances where each branch could limit the excesses of the other, not necessarily that they would. And so I think that there are times where this theory gets tested, Bobbi.
One influence on the framers' beliefs was their lifelong experience under the British monarchy. They saw an imbalance of power in the British monarchy where the monarch, who was a king or a queen, depending on the time period, used bribes and special favors to control elections and exercise too much power over Parliament, which is the British legislative body. The king also used the exclusive power of the monarch to appoint people to office as a reward to friendly members of Parliament. Think the spoils system which started under Andrew Jackson in the United States. Remember, to the victor belongs the spoils.
Yeah.
The framers saw this as corruption in the British monarchy's balance of power, and they also saw it trickling over into some of the colonial legislatures in America. They also saw that several of the new states had established their state governments with weak executives who were unable to check the powers of the state legislatures. And citizens in some of these states claimed that the legislatures were passing laws that violated their basic rights. So these were influences on the framers as they went to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 and ended up writing the Constitution that we still honor today, almost 250 years later. They were going to Philadelphia. Their mission was to just revise the Articles of Confederation, but they, if you recall, saw too many problems with it.
Context matters so much, and I'm glad we're delving into this because they were just coming out of a period where they were lorded over and ruled over. And so this whole system is so sensitive and built into how we operate today.
Besides seeing King George in particular at the end there abusing his power so much, especially over the colonies, this was all fresh on their minds and stuff they wanted to not have in their new government now that they were independent.
They wanted to make sure that they got it right and that it would be working 250 years later.
So in addition to the weakness they saw in the Articles and the abuses of the British monarchy, another big influence on the framers came from the man often just known as Montesquieu. He was an 18th century French judge, intellectual, historian, and philosopher, and the main source of the theory of separation of powers. Montesquieu published what's in English, the title is The Spirit of Law, in 1748, which was originally printed in French, and I don't speak French, so I did not include the French title.
Want to butcher it? Yeah.
I thought, I'm just going to give the English title.
The Spirit of Law works.
But it was published only in French in the beginning, and then it was translated and published in the English language just 2 years later in 1750. Montesquieu was highly regarded in the British colonies in North America as a champion of liberty. According to a survey of late 18th century works by political scientist Donald Lutz, Montesquieu was the most frequently quoted authority on government and politics in colonial pre-revolutionary America. Following the American Revolution, his work remained a powerful influence on many of the American founders, most notably James Madison of Virginia, who, remember, is known as the father of the Constitution. Montesquieu's philosophy that, quote, government should be set up so that no man need be afraid of another, end quote, reminded Madison and others that a free and stable foundation for their new national government required a clearly defined and balanced separation of powers. Montesquieu saw two types of government power existing, what he called the sovereign and the administrative. The sovereign is where supreme authority lies. Under the U.S. Constitution today, the people are the sovereign, or where ultimate authority for the government comes from. So when you hear that term sovereign, which is sometimes used,
sovereign
that's
nation.
what it means. This is where the highest authority or the power is. That's why it's we the people in the beginning, the first words of the Constitution.
I feel like we have to remind people about our being a sovereign.
It's not Congress and it's not the president. It's the people.
It's us.
So that takes us into the administrative powers are the legislative, executive, and judicial. He said these should be separate from and dependent upon each other. Now, think about what I just said. Separate from and dependent upon each other, so that the influence of any one power would not be able to exceed that of the other two, either singly or in combination. This idea was radical for the 18th century, and it was a move away from the feudalistic structure that had been around since the Middle Ages. The old structures of government usually included the clergy or church, the monarchy or the wealthy, aristocracy, and the people who often, under feudal times were the peasants. Now, Montesquieu also identified three main forms of government, each supported by a social principle. He said monarchies, that's one of his forms, a free government headed by a hereditary figure such as a king, queen, or an emperor, which rely on the social principle of honor. Then the second one is republics, free governments headed by popularly elected leaders, which rely on the principle of virtue. Remember, virtue means moral goodness. We keep talking about Ben Franklin's civic virtues. And then the final type of government or form of government is despotisms, or think in terms of the tyrant, the authoritarian, or the unfree. So headed by a despot, which rely on fear. That's their social principle, fear. He said the free governments are dependent on constitutional arrangements that establish checks and balances.
And I hear the bell, and that means we're going to take a break for you got to take off your civics hat and put on your history teacher hat.
Don't know much about history.
So this is our Don't Know Much About History segment. One of the most significant events leading up to the American Revolution took place on the night of December 16th, 1773, as a response to the Tea Act passed by British Parliament earlier that year, which granted the British East India Company the exclusive right to sell tea in the American colonies. While the British had repealed many of its earlier duties or taxes, the tax on tea remained, which angered many of the American colonists as they saw it as yet another example of taxation without representation. In protest of the Tea Act, which lowered the price of tea but cut colonial merchants out of the trade, a group of Bostonians, some disguised as Native Americans, boarded 3 British ships docked in Boston Harbor. They carefully dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. Their goal wasn't random destruction, but a clear and targeted statement against what they saw as taxation without representation. The Boston Tea Party became a powerful symbol of colonial resistance and helped unite many colonists against British rule.
Their message worked, number one.
Right.
It was one of the most effective campaigns to do anything.
Exactly.
And I just saw a commercial, I think, for the Dodge Ram, and they are using the Boston Tea Party as the theme. So you want to talk about message that sticks and lasts.
Right.
I don't know who their PR person was for the Boston Tea Party, but we need some folks like that. But that was a fun one. All right. Let's jump back in.
Okay, back to James Madison, who had read and studied Montesquieu. And as like the other framers, many of them had higher education when a lot of people didn't back in the 1700s. A lot of them had read and studied these philosophers like Montesquieu. So Madison used a lot of this in his own thinking and writings. And in Madison's essay, Federalist number 47, he wrote, quote, "The accumulation of all powers in the legislative, executive, and judiciary in the hands of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elected, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." End quote. This suggests that the 3 branches be distinct, but not entirely separate. In Federalist number 48, Madison cautioned that unless the separate branches of a government, quote, "be so far connected and blended or balanced as to give each a constitutional control or check over the others, the degree of separation essential to a free government can never in practice be duly maintained," end quote. This essay argues that the legislative branch could easily usurp or seize or take the power from the executive and judicial branches. Remember, we talked about the Federalist Papers. They were written in response to writing the new Constitution and then defending it as it went through the ratification process. So that's why Madison is defending why they did some of the things that they did in this new Constitution. Continuing Madison's theory of separation of powers, he primarily outlined in Federalist number 51, which is one of the, if you study these, there's like 10 and Federalist 10, and then 51 is, they're all important, but these are like the biggies. So this is where he kind of lays out his thinking on this. And he dictates that dividing government into 3 independent branches, which they had already decided would be called the legislative, executive, and judicial, prevents tyranny by forcing them to check each other. Madison argued that, quote, ambition must be made to counteract ambition, end quote, using personal interests of officials to protect constitutional boundaries. So it's like each part wants to protect their part, and to do that, they have to prevent the other parts from having too much power.
For it to ideally work, you have to make sure that you're protecting the power of your unit.
Right. Madison believed that concentrating power in one branch or even 2 was the definition of tyranny, regardless of whether it was managed by one person or a group. He did not advocate for a total rigid separation, but rather that each branch should have the necessary tools, which we will talk about in a little bit, that's what the checks are. Mm-hmm. And some examples of those before we get into them are like the veto power, Senate advice and consent. Those are all checks or the tools that they set up, to prevent one branch from becoming too powerful. He famously argued that the legislative branch would naturally be the strongest, necessitating that it be further divided into a bicameral legislature to keep it in check. So they created another check within that branch. So that's why we have a Senate and a House of Representatives. They check each other. Madison explained that U.S. power is split first between federal and state governments, then subdivided into distinct departments, providing, quote, double security, end quote, for civil liberties. So, if you think about it, our whole system, our federal system means that we have federal governments, and then each of our states has its government. And then if you think about it within the states, each county has governments, and each city has
each town. Yep.
Think about all of these are like their own little checks and balances amongst each other.
The only thing to critique our framers, can I be so bold?
Sure.
And maybe you know the answer is I wonder that because they were so sensitive to each group maintaining its power and control and how important it was to check the other, too, why they didn't think about longevity of people staying in these positions too long or term limits. It just that seemed, maybe that's just something that didn't dawn on them. But
I think that they thought because of the time period they lived in, if you think back to like Washington, he said 2 terms was enough. Mm-hmm. It needed to move on to someone else. And I think that was something that was common in their virtues at that time, that they just kind of thought, people will maintain this civic virtue that they have, and they'll realize that, okay, I've done.
They were relying on tradition.
Yeah. I think that really is a lot of their thinking.
Yeah,
they didn't think people would get in there, and serve for 60 years or I don't know how old Chuck Grassley is.
But so many of the things that they did think of were enduring and did last and were way ahead of their times. That's just term limits are just one that I wanted to ask you about.
But if you think about it, they did put the mechanism in there that could be changed with an, constitutional amendment.
True.
So once you see a problem, and that's why a lot of our amendments are to address problems that have arisen since the Constitution was written. So it's certainly up to Congress. They could change that. They could address that as a problem that they see, which, that's been batted around. But,
for a long time. I wonder what polling would show us on what Americans think in terms of that. Now, I know like in the House, those are 2-year terms. And so I feel like by the time you get in the House, it probably takes at least 1 term to get acclimated to the job.
Oh, I would think.
But, I wonder how Americans feel about it. I know how I feel about it, but I definitely think that that's something that maybe sometime we should take a look at.
They were, as I've thought about what you said, I'm thinking, they didn't address it, but they certainly created a way that it could be addressed. And that was the purpose of putting that in the Constitution, because they were smart enough to know that if this Constitution endured, times would change.
Yeah.
So they put in a way to fix things that might arise. So
they were brilliant, definitely brilliant minds.
Definitely. Madison explained that the structure of the government must provide the necessary checks and balances, arguing that since, quote, men are not angels, end quote, government requires controls. Again, from Federalist number 51, this is one of the most famous quotes from this one, and it's a little bit longer, but I think it's really important to understanding Madison's thinking. So here's his quote: "But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment of the others. The provision for defense must in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself." End quote. Separating power was viewed as crucial for protecting personal freedoms, which often are the first thing to go under a tyrant or a despot or an authoritarian. This was to protect personal freedom against government overreach. The structure promotes a government run by established laws rather than the arbitrary will of men. The structure forces the branches to work together, ensuring that no single branch becomes too powerful and limiting government excesses. They believed that human nature was imperfect and ambitious, so they designed a structure where the, quote, ambition of each branch, end quote, would check the ambitions of the others. And I think that long quote from Federalist 51 supports what I just said there. They realized that, like you said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need any government. So.
Exactly.
So the system was deliberately designed to make governing intentional and often slow rather than quick and easy to prevent rash actions. The structure was designed to slow down the lawmaking process and force cooperation between branches, preventing impulsive or arbitrary government action. And I just want to stick in there, that's one of the big complaints is it takes Congress too long. Well, this is the reason. Now, I agree. Sometimes they go, especially in recent years, it's kind of gone to the excess, but that's just because they won't talk to each other. But if in a regular deliberative Congress, if we look back to normal times or what we thought of as normal times, yes, they can't pass a law, like you present it today and tomorrow it's a law, generally.
Thankfully, yeah.
They want them to think about it and discuss options. And, like multiple minds may have some different ideas to put in there. So it was meant to be deliberative.
And just like amendments, too, it takes a long, long time and several bodies of Congress and the people getting involved to change that, thankfully.
Right. Also, the bicameral or two-house structure of Congress increases that difficulty to pass laws, especially at the whim of popular majorities, because laws do have to go through both houses of Congress. The framers agreed with John Locke, another one of those famous philosophers we talked about a long time ago, that the power to make laws is the greatest power a government possesses, and it should be done deliberatively. The framers saw how ineffective the Articles of Confederation were with no executive branch, so they thought it was necessary to create executive officials for specific purposes, such as coordination of foreign affairs and management of the Treasury. They wanted the executive branch to have enough power and independence to carry out its duties and responsibilities quickly if necessary, so it would not be as deliberative as the legislative branch. But they also did not want to give the executive branch power and independence that that could be abused. The framers also saw the need for a system for deciding cases involving laws. A judicial branch would complete the system of separation of powers. They agreed that judges should be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. There's a check, by the way. They also agreed that all criminal trials should be trials by jury. They believed these to be very important checks on the power of government. They created the Supreme Court as the head of the national judiciary, but left the power to create lower federal courts to Congress, which Congress did in the Judiciary Act of 1789. The framers said that judges should be independent of politics so they could use their best judgment to decide cases free from political pressure. And I put a big asterisk out beside that. I want people to understand that judges are supposed to be independent of politics. So it was also decided that judges would hold office for life unless they are impeached, which is accused, and convicted of, quote, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote. The judiciary was also given the power to decide conflicts between state governments as well as any involving the national government, so like the states versus the national government. So let's review separation of powers. We have the legislative branch or Congress that makes laws and holds the, quote, power of the purse, end quote, to set budgets, confirms presidential nominations, and can impeach officials. The executive branch, which is the president and cabinet agencies, enforces laws, commands the armed forces, and issues executive orders, but cannot create laws. And the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts, interprets laws, applies the Constitution, and reviews the constitutionality of acts by the other branches. That's the separation of powers. Now, let's take a look at how these three branches, or the separate powers, check and balance each other, or why they are often referred to as being co-equal branches. First of all, think of a check as a tool or as a stop, or at least a temporary stop or slow down to an action. In implementing separation of powers, the framers limited the powers of each branch through certain procedures and established that they have certain shared powers. Some of these shared powers include legislative power, the power to declare war, impeachment, the power to make treaties and to appoint cabinet members and ambassadors, and judicial review. The president shares in the legislative power through the veto. If they veto a bill, that means that they're stopping it, or also at least temporarily stopping it. So that's the president or the executive checking legislative power. Because the legislative branch has passed a law, it goes to the president for his signature or not. And if he vetoes it, that's a check on their power. So the president can veto a bill or a possible law passed by Congress, but the bill can still become a law if 2/3 of both houses of Congress vote to override the veto. That's another check. Now they're checking the executive branch power. The veto power is found in Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution. Although the term veto is not used, it uses the words approve or disapprove. As of December 2024, U.S. presidents have vetoed a total of 2,596 bills since 1789.
Wow.
With 112 of those vetoes being overridden by Congress. And that's another check, like I said. The power to appoint executive branch officials, such as the president's cabinet members and federal judges, is a shared power between the president and Congress. The president nominates a person to the cabinet or as a federal judge, and the Senate has the power to approve or disapprove of the person appointed. That's a check on executive power, and also what's known as advice and consent, if you hear that term bantered about on the news. This is detailed in Article 2, Section 2. The president has the power to negotiate a treaty with another nation, but the treaty must be approved by a 2/3 vote of the Senate. Again, another check by the legislative branch on the executive branch. That's found in Article 2, Section 2 as well.
Can a president end a treaty on his own, or is that something that has to go through Congress?
That has to go through Congress.
Okay.
Although the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Article 2, Section 2 again, only Congress, in fact, it's specifically the Senate, has the power to declare war, which is found in Article 1, Section 8. Congress also controls the money necessary to pay for a war effort, and that's found in the House of Representatives. So the Senate has to approve, and the House has to dictate the money or not, whether money's going to be appropriated. So we kind of have a double check there, if you will, on executive action. So the power to declare and wage war is also a shared power. So more checks, more balancing. Impeachment, another check of the president and members of the executive branch, federal judges, and also members of Congress can all be impeached. And remember, we've talked about impeachment. That's just bringing charges against an official.
It's not necessarily removing them.
Right. And they can be removed if they are found guilty of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And that's a power given to Congress in Article 1, Section 2. But again, it's divided. The House of Representatives can bring impeachment against an official, and the Senate holds the trial to determine the official's guilt or innocence. That's the conviction or acquittal. It takes 2/3 vote of the Senate for conviction. If that happens, the official is removed from office.
And when it comes to President Bobbi, I know we've impeached presidents multiple times, but we've never removed a president, have we?
No, we have not.
But we have removed, I think, Supreme Court justices.
There have been, it's like a handful of other officials. It's not a huge amount, I'm sure. The Constitution does not specify that the Supreme Court can decide whether acts of Congress or the president are constitutional, but many of the framers assumed the court would have this power because this was the case with the judiciary of many of the states. Judicial review is the power of U.S. courts to examine and invalidate government actions, whether legislative or executive, that violate the Constitution. So this is acting as a key check on the power of the other two branches of government by the judicial branch. This idea of judicial review isn't written into the Constitution. It was actually established by the Supreme Court in the case Marbury versus Madison in 1803. It ensures that government actions conform to the Constitution and laws. Judicial review helps enforce separation of powers. It includes reviewing federal, state, and administrative agency decisions. The Supreme Court has struck down acts of Congress 182 times in the history of the court, with the last action happening on December 20th, 2006, when it struck down the Stolen Valor Act. The U.S. Supreme Court has struck down presidential actions and executive orders on multiple occasions, often when a president exceeds constitutional or statutory, which means legal, authority. While precise, universally agreed upon numbers vary, the court has historically ruled against presidential overreach in several landmark cases, with some observers pointing to over a dozen instances of unanimous rulings regarding excessive authority. Some key historical rulings limiting presidential action include Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer, which was a 1952 case, when the court ruled that President Truman could not seize steel mills. Another case is United States versus Nixon in 1974, probably one more people are familiar with, when the court ruled that a president's executive privilege was not absolute and could not prevent the release of evidence. In the case National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning, a 2014 case, the court unanimously ruled that President Obama exceeded his authority regarding recess appointments. And finally, regarding Trump tariffs of 2026, the court ruled against the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or you hear it on the news as IEPA, to impose certain tariffs. These four cases are just some of the cases involving presidential authority, but the court does usually act with restraint when considering executive actions. A federal judge can order the president, or more commonly, executive branch officials, to take or cease specific actions if they are found to be unconstitutional or unlawful. While courts generally avoid directly ordering the president personally, they issue injunctions against administration policies, upholding the principle that no one is above the law. A judge can issue a preliminary injunction to pause a policy if it causes immediate irreparable harm. And an example I thought of there, I didn't write this in, but like the planes taking people to El Salvador last year, that was stopped by an injunction because they had to do it now. I mean, Some of the planes had already left. The ones that left were supposed to turn around. I remember right, they didn't, but it stopped any further action at that time. So that was an injunction. And what that does is it waits then for the case to make it through
to resolve
the actual courts. The judiciary is a co-equal branch of government. Its orders are not optional, though, and presidents are expected to abide by them. Hopefully, you can now not only name the three branches of our U.S. government, but also name some of their main duties. In addition, you should now have an understanding of separation of powers and checks and balances among the three branches of government, including an understanding of some of the constitutional mechanisms that ensure no single branch of government becomes too powerful and that force cooperation between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And I might point out there, and I think we mentioned this earlier, those mechanisms, they only work if the branch that has the ability to put them out there actually uses those. So the checks only work if the branch that has that ability follows through.
Right.
And you mentioned the could or would.
Yes.
They're there, and I'm going to say they should be used
Yes. There you go.
Like branch A sees branch B doing something that they know they shouldn't be doing. It should at least go through the process of investigating it. You should also understand that the framers established our government with separation of powers mainly to prevent tyranny and protect individual liberty by ensuring that no individual person or group could gain too much power.
Very good. Time for the pop quiz.
So, last episode's question, what does the judicial branch do? And I mentioned there are 4 different things that I have written down, and if you knew any of them, give yourself a pat on the back. But here are the 4 main duties of the judicial branch. They review laws, they explain laws, and a lot of times you'll see that in a decision, a court decision. They'll explain,
Right.
how they applied the law, what the law is. So you can find those explanations in their decisions that they have to render. They can also resolve disputes or disagreements. I mentioned earlier, disputes within our constitutional framework of our national or federal government. They also resolve disputes between the states and the federal government. And finally, they decide if a law goes against the constitutional, or the word is if it's unconstitutional.
Yeah.
That's what it means.
So there are your answers. 4 answers. We should now all know what the judicial branch does. Do you have a question for next time?
I do. How many justices are there on the U.S. Supreme Court? And that is
right
currently.
Now. Yes.
Because it has changed,
It
and
has.
I mentioned this before. Over the course of our 250 years, there have been various numbers of justices. Congress can reduce or add to. That's a power that they have.
Yep. So right now in 2026, how many U.S. Supreme Court justices do we have? That's the question.
Right.
So we're going to talk real quick before we wrap up today of a couple current events. One, I know you want to talk about an Indiana decision. Something I wanted to mention before we go to that we saw play out since we've talked last time, Bobbi, is the election in Hungary. How it proves that when people come to the election box and vote, even when the systems and the districts for voting are rigged against their voice, that they can still make a change. So recently, Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Hungary was just defeated and
handily.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I was following it along because there was not a lot of news coverage on it here in the United States. So I was like scrambling, trying to find information on it. And the returns were coming in very slowly. And it looked like it was going to be like a 50-50 split, but then it just split open.
Right.
And it was amazing to watch how the power of somebody's vote can change things when all hope seems like it's lost.
We lost one authoritarian leader with that defeat. And also, and I don't know the numbers, but my understanding is they had like a 70% turnout, and that was massive for their country.
It's a good lesson for Americans to see. We need to understand how important it is for us to come out. We have such pathetic voter registration numbers, and we have pathetic voter turnout when it comes to especially in year-off election years that aren't presidential like this one, where it's midterms on the line. But a lot's on the line because it's control of Congress that's on the line.
And so far, I mean, in the primaries that have been held so far in the special elections, turnout for those in an off year, and especially for these special elections filling seats that have been vacated early, the turnout's been much higher than in the past. So
and they just had a special election in New Jersey to fill a seat.
And that was a massive blowout. We, the people, just keep thinking that we are the ones that have to stand up and speak out and vote and protest, and regardless of what the detractors try to say, because they're detracting because they're trying to preserve what they are doing. So
agreed. And you have another example of how every voice and vote counts. And there was just a decision made by a judge pertaining to college students in Indiana.
Right. On Tuesday this week, a federal judge blocked Indiana's ban on using student IDs as voter identification, a victory that will make it easier for students and young voters to cast ballots in this upcoming midterm election. Now, this was a sweeping decision issued Tuesday by federal U.S. District Judge Richard L. Young. It's a preliminary injunction, so we just talked about that.
So that means it immediately pauses.
It takes effect immediately, but it is a pause on Indiana Senate Bill 10, which was a Republican-backed law that eliminated use of student IDs, which had been acceptable in Indiana. We talked about this 2 episodes ago in our voter episode. What it means is students can again use their IDs in the upcoming elections this year as it works its way through court. And it says this could affect up to around, this is a rough estimate, about 40,000 students are affected by this law, being able to use their student IDs. So again, the people, this was a case brought by a group of voters, and, they spoke out against it and they won. It's temporarily won.
Exactly. And I think the judge might have even said in his decision to pause the law, he believes ultimately, as it works its way up through the court system, that that law will be struck down ultimately by the high court. So, and as we talked about it, they pause it because it could have had an immediate detrimental effect on our elections here in Indiana when you disenfranchise 40,000 plus voters.
Students especially are going to have a more difficult time. They're not at home, so they're probably not, if they're going to say Purdue, for example, and living in West Lafayette, but their home is in Jeffersonville, that's a long way away to have to go to try to get proper identification.
There could be transportation issues. Lots of things. So,
and I see this, as this SAVE Act is still in the news, and I've been seeing ads for it. And it's listen to what the places that have already tried it. Look at Kansas. Look at some of these other detrimental actions that they've tried to take in various places to prevent people from voting. And in most cases, like you said, they end up being overturned because we don't want to roll back. That's just like having poll taxes and other ways to keep people from voting. It's our most important right.
It is.
It is. It really is. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but somebody argued with me online. Well, but aren't you for having, people should have to show that they're a citizen? It's okay, right. I agree. But when they passed the new ID, you
had to get the special driver's license.
I had to go to a different county to get a copy of my official registered marriage license to show why my birth certificate name was not the same as the name on my current driver's license in order to get the new real ID. So I've already done all that. And now you're telling me
that's not enough.
I may have to go do something no, I already have a supposedly valid real ID.
Secure
that the United
ID?
States, it could get me on a plane.
A lot of folks will argue, well, it's because of voter fraud. But when you really dig down and peel back the layers on that, it's such a tiny, yes. So we'll watch that SAVE Act and see how it plays out. Good discussion today.
Not partisan, just real world things to consider.
If you disagree with us, let us know. We have to be open to criticisms to grow, and you can contact us at Plain Civics podcast at gmail.com, plaincivicspodcast@gmail.com, or you can send us a message on our Facebook page, which is Plain Civics. Just search for that.
You didn't ask me what we're doing next time.
I didn't. Do we know?
I'm not 100% sure, but we're back to the basics. So it may be, maybe looking at, I'm not sure, some more specific part of one of the branches of government or deeper dig into First Amendment. I haven't put any thought. I've been working, so I haven't put
Getting back to the
much
basics, is that, well, I used to have a teacher that said that we needed to get back to brass tacks. So is that where we're headed?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
and
you
depends
again.
on what, the world situation
It
happens
does.
between them.
And a lot could happen between now and the next time I see your face on the screen. So we'll talk to you then. That's it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics. No politics, just facts. Thanks for listening. And until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works so you can make the government work for you.